Hey everybody, tonight's video is called The Burden Against Moab, Part 1. And tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Isaiah, where we're looking at the burden against Moab. And so we're going to take a look at today in our very next video chapter against the burden against Moab. And the demise of Moab taught Israel not to depend on them, any other nation, more than the Lord. And this oracle of judgment was delivered right around the time of Sargon's defeat of Moab in 715 BC. And so today's chapter is going to be very short. We're going to have a very short wrap up to it as well. We might be 10 minutes, maybe less, maybe a little bit more. But Isaiah 15 verse 1 through 4 says, "The burden against Moab, because in the night Ar of Moab is laid waste, and destroyed, because in the night of Ker of Moab is laid waste and destroyed. He has gone up to the temple in Dibon, to the high places to weep, Moab to wail over Nebo and over Medeba. On all their heads will be baldness, every beard cut off. In their streets they will clothe themselves with sackcloth, on the tops of their houses and in the streets. Everyone will wail, weeping bitterly. Heshbon and Elileh will cry out. Their voice shall be heard as far as Jahaz. Therefore the armed soldiers of Moab will cry out. His life will be a burdensome to him." So Moab, I think it's important that we talk about the geographical part of Moab. It's a country approximately 30 miles square east of the Dead Sea, south of the Arnon River and north of the Zered River. And two major cities of Moab were Ar and Ker. And Moab was between the Ammonites and the Edomites. In the ancient world, she was often tense with Judah. She did not get along with the southern kingdom. And the founder of the people of Moab was the son born of the incest relationship between Lot and one of his daughters, who made him drunk after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which you can find the story about Lot's daughters in Genesis 19 verse 30 through 38. And it was the king of Moab, Balak, hired Balaam the prophet, hoping that he could with Israel in Numbers 22 through 25 chapters. So you can look at Balaam the prophet and what his role was with the king of Moab. And the king of Moab, Eglon, oppressed Israel in the days of the judges in Judges chapter 3 verse 12 through 30. And Israel had firm control over Moab during the time of Saul and David's reign. And then after that, the kings after David, you kind of see Israel lost grip. And Moab chose the temple of the Moab god Chemosh at Dibon, which was 3 miles north of the Arnon. And it was known as the place of weeping because that god had failed to deliver the nation. And Nebo is the mountain at the north end of the Dead Sea, where the Lord took Moses to view the promised land back in Deuteronomy 34 verse 1. And Medeba is 5 miles southeast of Nebo. And the shaving of heads and beards, it was a practice, as we talk about commonly, quite often in the Old Testament. It was an act of disgrace and humiliation to have your head shaved or your beard shaved. And you can find it in texts such as Leviticus 21:5. And the wearing of sackcloth occurs 46 times in the Bible. And it's a sign of mourning. So there was a lot of mourning in the Old Testament. And the city Heshbon was less than 20 miles east of the northern end of the Dead Sea, in a territory claimed by Israel in Moab in Deuteronomy chapter 2 verse 32 and 33. And Elileh was approximately a mile away from Heshbon. And the invasion will be a great distress to Moab. And we'll look also at that part, the other prophecy against Moab, in Jeremiah chapter 48, which is going to be right around the time of the holidays. Lord willing. In verse 5 through 7, it says, "My heart will cry out for Moab, his fugitives shall flee to Zoar like a 3-year-old heifer. For by the accent of Luhith they will go up with weeping, for in the way of Horonaim they will raise up a cry of destruction. For the waters of Nimrim will be desolate, and the green grass is withered away. The grass fails, and there is nothing green. Therefore the abundance they have grain in what they have had laid up, and they will carry away to the brook of the willows." So the prophecy expresses much greater sympathy for Moab's plight than for the other nations to be judged, even allowing for a surviving remnant. And in verse 3, we see 3-year-old heifer, and most translations substitute that with Eglath Salishaya, and I like the New King James because they're just like, we're not going to deal with those tongue-sounding names. We're just going to call it the 3-year heifer. And Eglath Shalishaya is a city, unknown location, along with other cities in the verse. We see Luhith and Horonaim. And Isaiah, we should notice, has a lot of sympathy for Moab. And the prophet Isaiah knew that Moab was the land, the hometown of Ruth. So he had more sympathy for Moab than any of the other nations that are announced the judgment of God. And just like their forefather Lot, the Moabites flee to Zoar. As I mentioned, you can check out Genesis 19, verse 23 through 30, or more, of that chapter if you want to read about Lot. And their escape route appears to go south while the enemies are coming from the north. So they're escaping from their enemies. And verse 6, Nimrim is possibly the Radi Numeria, the drying up of whose waters, along with the dead grass, pictures widespread devastation in Moab. And in verse 7, the brook of the willows was probably the Zered River, the river that the refugees from Moab had to cross over into Edom while they escaped the enemy trying to invade them. And, when they went through this river, they had to carry everything that they had or leave it behind in the land. And the last couple verses here, 8 and 9, says, "For the cry has gone out all around the borders of Moab. It's wailing to Eglaim, and it's wailing to Beer Elim. For the waters of Dimon will be full of blood, because I will bring more upon Dimon, lions upon him who escapes from Moab, and on the remnant of the land." So in verse 9, we see another word, Dimon, and we're going to discuss that here. But the shouts of the fugitives reached all the way into the northern part of Edom, that's Eglaim, to its southern extremity, Beer Elim. And in verse 9, Dimon is another spelling for what we find in verse 2, Dibon. And this religious center of heathendom is appropriate as a closing representation of the whole land of Moab. And flight from invading armies wouldn't bring them security. They might be fleeing those who want to cause them harm, but there's new dangers from the beast in the wilderness, and we see lions used in the verse. And Dimon and Dibon was a city of the Arnon River, remember. And their pain in the midst of judgment is evident to all. And you might be like, this chapter's a little bit dry. There's not really much, interesting information that I wanted to get out of this. One thing I want you to think about out of this whole video, that God will finish his work of judgment. When God says he's going to judge, he's going to judge. God ain't playing. And tonight, we wrap up here looking at the night invasion of Moab, which is a burden. And through verse 4, we see the cities and the soldiers of Moab fall under a night attack. In verse 5 through 7, the flight of the refugees from Moab. And the chapter ends with the cries of the refugees from Moab. And that's going to wrap up today's video. As we'll see in next, we're looking at the continued burden against Moab. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless, and I'll let you know when the next study will be.